Hi, this is Chris from Orange Coast College's Art Department, covering Photoshop's free transform and warp tools for digital painters and illustrators. Now, I find that transforming is one of the most used functions I get out of Photoshop. And so let's step through a few of the options. First, where can we find it? Take a look at the Edit menu. Go about halfway down here, and you'll see a bunch of transform tools. And these come in handy, but I normally don't use them here except for the flip horizontal and flip vertical you see at the bottom. What I use instead is the free transform tool. And what this gives me is when we enter free transform, we can do all of those top transform functions except for the bottom two. So rather than look in the transform menu, let's go right into free transform. So while we're in free transform, you really want to pay attention to how the cursor changes depending on what you're doing with it. So when I'm outside my object or selection, I have the rotate tool, and we know that because it's got the bent arrow pointing 90 degrees from each other. So if I want to rotate my object, all I need to do is click and drag, and if I want to constrain to 45 degrees and 90 degrees, I can hold down Shift and it'll constrain me here. That's often really helpful. Now let's find a few more of those functions. Let's say we wanted to scale an object. I can grab a corner and notice how the cursor changes to the opposing arrows. What this means is that I can drag this corner around and I can stretch high or I can stretch wide. If I want to stretch from the center outward, I'll hold down Option and it will scale from the center out. And if I want to make sure that I am constrained to keeping the same proportion, I'll hold down Shift, and that keeps me constrained to proportion. And if I want to be constrained to proportion and center, I hold down Shift and Option. And this way I can scale. Now you might have noticed some of the other ones, such as Skew. When I come Now you might have noticed some other functions as well. So we can stretch in one direction only by grabbing the center handle. And again, if I hold down Option, I can go in both directions. Same with horizontal. Or I can skew by holding down the Command key, and watch what happens. Here we go. I hold it down and I get this white arrow, and I can grab that middle and I can skew just like that. Now let's say I wanted to just grab a corner. Again, I can hold down the command, I get the white arrow, and I can hold down a corner. Now this could be pretty handy if, let's say, you wanted to put a square into perspective. And I can still access these other functions. Still rotate. I can still scale, and so on and so forth. So the trick to this is noticing how the cursor changes depending on what you are doing. You can also just move while you're in free transform mode. So you'll also notice up in the option bar, you can dial in coordinates, you can dial in scale percentage, angle rotation, all that type of thing. So you can get some degree of precision by entering numbers into these fields. So I'm going to, if I like what I see, I can hit enter or return, and if I don't like what I see, I want to go back to where I was, I can hit escape. But I'm going to go ahead and hit enter, and there's my transformed shape. So how might someone use this? Let's take a look at a really typical exercise. So we've got a cube here, and let's say we want to put a texture on it. But if we just overlay a texture, it's not going to look right in perspective. So I've got a little diamond plate texture here, and I'm going to make a clipping group out of this diamond plate texture and the left vertical side of the cube. So I'm going to go ahead and hold down Option, click the line between these layers, and now I've got a clipping group. So I can move this around, but you can see it doesn't look, it's not following the lines of perspective of the cube. So what can I do about that? Let's go ahead and go into Free Transform, and I can take these corners of my square-ish texture and move them to the corners of my cube. When I'm done, hit enter, and it looks like the texture is in correct perspective because it adheres to the shape of the cube. So that's pretty handy. This type of thing I use all the time. Now there's another really interesting mode, and that is warp. So let's take a look at another typical exercise. So here's a sphere, and what if we wanted to put a texture on that sphere? Let's take a quick look at it here. I've copied in this texture of a photo of some grass and dirt, and obviously it doesn't look great there. I'm going to go ahead and set it up as a clipping group, and let's enlarge this so that you can't see the sphere. When I do that, it really looks more like a disc, right? I've lost any sense of perspective going on. I should see on a sphere my texture foreshorten as it rounds the planes away from my eye. So as I go towards any of the edges, I should see foreshortening of texture. So there's a warp in the transform right down here, but also while you're in free transform, there's also a button for it right up here. So I can switch between free transform and warp modes just by hitting this button. So let's take a look at what that does. This, once I click it, gives me a flexible grid, a little 3x3 grid with some handles so that I can create some curves. I can both grab the corner points, control points, but I can also grab these lines in between. So I'm going to first grab these curves and stretch them in both directions. So I can stretch here and here, and I'll go on back one more time over here. So I've got a bit of a bulge going on, right? And I want to also bring in the corners. So I can bring this guy and bend him through. This is really going to help me with that foreshortening around the edge. So essentially what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take this 3x3 grid and turn it into a grid as if it might be wrapped around a sphere. Now it's not perfect, it's not like a 3D modeling texture, but we can approximate it pretty easily using the warp tool and some free transform in Photoshop. So once I get what I like, I go ahead and hit enter, and it warps it. And you notice in the center, I've got larger texture facing right at me, and as I move towards any of the edges, I can see that texture foreshortening. Of course, it'd be great to have some lighting on here, so let's see. Let's first try duplicating and getting two of these layers that has the shading on them. And the bottom layer I'm going to flip into multiply mode and see what that looks like. That makes it nice and dark. And then this upper duplicate, I'm going to do soft light. So that combination of soft light and multiply should give me a little bit of shading on that. And I think with both the lighting and the foreshortening of the texture, I think that gives us a good idea what this ought to look like. So I hope that helps you out. So remember, free transform, get to know the keyboard shortcut, Command-T on Macs, Control-T on PCs. I use this all the time. Every once in a while I'll use the warp, but the free transform gets me into quick rotations, quick scales, quick perspective, quick skewing, and the combination of being able to work all those things together is really helpful. So good luck and keep on making great art.